The first question is, what program or service that you or your family receive that you do not want to give up under any circumstance? Really identifying your number one priority that the province participates in. And that's here in the room, and for those of you online, please take a moment to think about that question and let us know. This information will help inform us as we make our decisions and deliberate budgets going forward for this year. And it's also important that when you're making submissions and recommendations to recognize that, again, the budget for 16-17 is a one-year document, but it also includes forecasts out into future years. Not all changes can be recognized. If we see changes in priorities for Nova Scotians, it may take time to implement. So not all changes will necessarily get reflected in this year's immediate 16-17 planned spending. But it doesn't mean it won't influence where our thought process is and the work that we move forward if it is a true change in the priorities of Nova Scotians for where we spend our money. So what is that one place, one program or service you couldn't live without as a Nova Scotian? Okay, and actually I guess just to carry the time forward, I know especially if you're online it may feel a little strange, so we have a moderator here, Professor Jim Bickerton with the Political Science Department, has a couple of questions. I believe they probably came in from the web.
They did. We have a couple of questions from Twitter. They're questions that are a little less constrained than if you're sitting in the room here in terms of their topics. First, Nan from Twitter says, why are you trying to convince us the sky is falling when the deficit is actually quite small, less than 1% of GDP?
The challenge here is, with our deficit, is the point that I made earlier. It would be one thing if we were just fluctuating down with a deficit outside, and it's a one-off, or a short-term scenario. The problem that we have in Nova Scotia is that it's the norm, not the exception. So just imagine if you're managing your own home finances, how sustainable maxing out your credit cards and your line of credit or spending and borrowing to manage your day-to-day operations on an everyday basis is. And that's the challenge we have. It's because we haven't developed a sustainable approach to delivering programs and services in the province. And that's what I'm moving forward on establishing. We've seen improvements. I mean, you can look back at the last number of years. We are moving in the right direction. So it's not a sky is falling in that context. And certainly I expect to hear from Nova Scotians and from people saying, well, look at Newfoundland. They just announced $2 billion that they're anticipating for deficit. We're not the worst off. And so we can see those comparisons. I can anticipate seeing those comparisons being made. Well, if Nova Scotia is only forecasting a $200 million and a slightly smaller province and is forecasting 10 times that amount, how bad can Nova Scotia be? Well, how about during the good times that Newfoundland experienced and the revenues that they were receiving during the heyday of their offshore oil and gas royalties? We didn't see that. And yet we continued to run deficits while they were running surpluses. So, we don't see those same comparisons. And that's why we don't have these huge growth swings. We don't have the big ups and downs in Nova Scotia. So we have to work, and it's through conscious, steady fiscal management that will get us there. And I'm confident we'll get there. But it does take conscious effort, and that's the scenario.
You'll be coming to the people with the budget before the federal budget comes down, do you think? I mean, how are you calculating the federal transfers just based on last year's amount? Or?
Yeah, so our starting place with a budget, so if we're talking about where do our revenue forecasts come from and our expenses, so on a revenue side, we do start with last year's budget, and then through economic modeling, so I'm going to answer all of them, not just the federal piece, but all of the forecasting. So if you're looking at the growth in income taxes and consumption taxes, we look at what we were doing last year, and then you take in economic data information that you have, and through economic modeling and forecast approaches, and the data that we have that shows the trends that we can expect, and based on historical performances, it all feeds in, and that's how we calculate our expected growth there. From a federal perspective, you're right. Until the federal budget comes down, we don't know with certainty. But again, it's a forward-looking document, so we take the best information we have from conversations we've had with our federal counterparts. Sometimes programs and commitments are made before the budget is actually brought forward, not unlike our capital plan, which was brought forward already.
Last time I'll do a little follow-up there is the federal budget is projecting quite a large deficit, and they're doing that quite proactively and presenting it as a positive thing. Clearly, you're not going in that direction. Has it got something to do with our debt to GDP ratio? Why can't we do what the feds are doing?
Well, it does tie into our fiscal situation, which is different than the federal government and some other provincial jurisdictions as well, which is how much flexibility and capacity do we have? At the federal level, what they're seeing here and they're anticipating is they're taking the mix of the entire country's economy. So when we saw the oil growth taking place, we were seeing some jurisdictions, primarily, and our Canadian dollar started to grow, jurisdictions that were resource intensive, particularly oil and gas, but other commodities as well, saw huge economic growth. But that growth was offset a bit in other jurisdictions, particularly in manufacturing, because you saw the Canadian dollar appreciate and they had to respond to that. What you're experiencing today is the reverse of that trend, where the oil and gas is hurting, but with the low Canadian dollar, it's making our other exports far more attractive and moving the economy around that way. So on a Canadian context, the ups and downs all integrate. Their commitment on the deficit side is related to their capital side of the spend that they want to move on. Well, those capital spends that they're making are, yes, they're designing for stimulating purposes, but those capital investments are for long-term investments. So those capital initiatives, you're borrowing money to pay for something that you're receiving over time. The deficit that I'm focused on here, and our government is focused on, is the structural deficit, which is primarily operational driven, beyond our capital side of things. We have to deal with the operational piece. They've made a lot of changes from the 90s going forward that brought their books in a much better situation for those operational side of the equation, giving them some flexibility on the capital.
Will you take a question from the audience?
Yep.
Yeah. Question from the audience?
Last year, I had the privilege of reading Graham Steele's book about he's a former financial minister of the province, as you are now, and he spoke a lot about the inherent, the contradiction that's kind of come into play considering Nova Scotia's kind of their particular situation and how kind of grim the future looks economically for this province in particular, and. Essentially, the contradiction is major changes are needed to give Nova Scotia a chance in the future, but changes cost something. And the people, the constituents here, they don't want to pay more taxes, and there's not a lot of financial opportunity, and that's why people are leaving, which is only making the problem worse. So is this just kind of a more transparent way of you trying to inform the public, if you want a future, you're going to have to accept these negative, because we see this even with comment online, why are you making everything seem like the sky is falling? Well, are you basically trying to tell the public expect hard changes if you want real change?
Yeah, so I don't know if the mic would have picked. So the mic didn't pick it up. So I'm going to summarize what you've said, particularly for the online group and for others in the room. So essentially. It was, number one, a shout out to an earlier finance minister, Mr. Graham Steele, who is now, I believe, recently a professor at Dalhousie's School of Business. So he gets a shout out for his book. But noting the challenges that he noted, and which I am, yes, I'm restating that reality. But it's not just Mr. Steele. We commissioned and had a One Nova Scotia report that was led by the president of Acadia University, Ray Ivney. It's been called Now or Never, the One Nova Scotia report, and some people just call it the Ivney report. But that report, if you haven't read it, came out a little over about a year and a half, 18 months, 2 years ago. About 18 months ago, I think that came out. And that highlights all of these points as well, the demographic challenges, the impacts, and the fact that we do need to make big changes. And that report in particular had Nova Scotians talking. And it wasn't just the political elite, the academics, or the business community that were talking about the need for change. Nova Scotians were talking about it at Tim Hortons. They were talking about it around kitchen tables. They recognized that. And I do believe that Nova Scotians are ready for this conversation. And I do believe that Nova Scotians recognize that there is an opportunity for us to get there. And I think they're ready, because we have been making some of those hard decisions in the 2 budgets we've already tabled. Yep.
So I guess just like my follow-up to that is that
Who gave you a follow-up?
but I just like understanding that what you're saying is basically putting yourself in the public's disfavor so that you're risking a chance of being reelected. Because realistically, like major changes that are going to cost the people of this province, that's probably going to reflect on your reelection possibilities.
Yeah, and that's where the challenge. So the question, the follow-up question was, if you highlight the negative and the challenges, or you try to bring forward structural change, which may be negative to some people, because if you're improving one side, then someone's going to feel the pain on another side. Are you basically putting your political position at risk? I don't think so. I think particularly when you look at the response that we've had by Nova Scotians, the feedback that I personally am receiving, because this isn't the first time I've had this conversation, this isn't the first time I've delivered these messages. And I delivered them when I was MLA and Minister of Environment, before I was in the finance portfolio. This is one of our biggest challenges we have to deal with, and I believe Nova Scotians are ready for us to deal with it. In fact, I believe that's why Nova Scotians elected us in 2013. Are all people? Clearly not. You can look at the budgets we've brought in so far under Minister Whalen. We did make some changes that impacted certain groups perhaps more than others, and we've heard from them that they didn't like those changes. But I guarantee you that when we are making those decisions as a government, we are looking at the information that we have. We're evaluating not on any individual stakeholder groups for the decision making. We're trying to look at the entire province. We're trying to look at what decisions we make collectively so the total package moves Nova Scotia forward. That's how we make our decisions. And I believe all Nova Scotians, if they take the time, as I hope they do, both as they're preparing to submit other and more thoughtful and detailed submissions, that they will take that in consideration as well.
Question from online question, and I guess there's a bunch of these, not surprisingly, having to do with the controversial film tax incentive. So essentially the question is, you want to encourage economic growth, why not remove the cap on the film and TV incentive fund?
Sure. So I'm not sure if you're in the room aware of this, or if everybody online. So the film tax and incentive, there was a tax credit that we had in last year's budget. There was a change to that program. What the program was originally was that essentially salaries for Nova Scotia employees working on films would be subsidized at 50, and then there were some other escalators. It could go up to 65% of their salaries would be covered. And it was a tax credit program, which meant that really, as long as you met the criteria for the Nova Scotia content, whether you created or the company created or tax revenue for the province, directly paid taxes themselves, corporate taxes, they would receive a rebate from the province of Nova Scotia equaling between 50 and 65%. And there was no cap. That wasn't sustainable. It was growing at a rate, and much like our interest payments, because it's a tax credit program, it would be deciding, and the industry through their growth, which would be difficult for us to forecast and manage, would be happening and would impact our ability to spend on programs and priorities of Nova Scotians collectively. So the change that was made was a quarter of that amount you can still get upfront, with your taxes, and 3/4 of it would be based on and used as a credit against any taxes paid in the province. So it would be an in-out transaction directly then. We heard from the industry, from stakeholders, to the question or the point up there, when you make changes that impact a group, we heard loud and clear that was not going to work for them. So the Minister of Finance and representatives from the Finance Department and the Business Department met with representatives from the industry extensively in the spring, throughout the summer, and they developed a new program. So the tax credit's not there, it's now a fund. The fund format makes it easier for us to predict. There are references to caps. What we're talking about is budgeting, which is the whole conversation we're having. On any program or service, whether it be in healthcare or in education, we assess and we establish an amount that we expect to spend on that program or service. And for the film fund, I believe that amount was anticipated or forecasted at $10 million. And my understanding is, to date, it's not fully subscribed yet. So to have conversations about expanding and removing and making it an opportunity to grow, that's the exact challenge and problem we were having, again, for all Nova Scotians.
I have a few questions here from the class that are all sort of making the same point. And the point being that sometimes you have to spend money in order to generate more money for yourself. In this case, you're talking about the Graduate Retention Rebate, now surprisingly of interest to university students. Why don't you restore that? Another one is, why don't you use payroll rebates more often to attract companies to Nova Scotia? Another one is basically saying, if you're going to launch a series of cuts, how can cuts to the public sector or freezing wages help the economic growth situation? So they're all kind of linking.
Right, so it's that age-old economic question. So when you're talking about things like the Graduate Retention Rebate, there's a program, again, that was growing exponentially, but when we did the analysis as to whether or not more youth were staying in Nova Scotia since the program was introduced, the data showed they were not. Now, since we've made the changes to that program, and we've invested in programs like graduate scholarships, we've increased for post-grad studies. We've done the Graduate to Opportunities program, which I mentioned earlier, which is to encourage and incent, similar to the payroll rebate concept, for employers in the private sector to hire new grads. You know, when you apply and you see you need 2 to 5 years experience, how does a new grad even get considered for that job opportunity? They don't. So by providing an incentive of 25% in the first year and 12.5% in the second year of their salary, then all of a sudden employers are thinking, you know what? That offsets the onboarding cost of a new employee and are more likely to hire. And as I've mentioned, what have we seen? We've seen the biggest improvement that we've had in youth unemployment, age 15 to 24, since 2008. We're seeing the progress. We're seeing it actually pay off. We're seeing the growth and the improvement in our demographics slowly, but it is moving in that direction. So a program that wasn't delivering on the purpose of the program to a program that is. And what we hear from students is, we want a job. That's the big deciding factor when we graduate, whether we stay in Nova Scotia. By and large, if you spent 4 years here studying, then you've decided you like the area, you like what Nova Scotia has to offer. And if we offer a job, we have a higher chance of you staying. But if you don't have the job, we lose you.
Question from the audience? Yeah.
I'm just wondering, with the impacts of Alberta and obviously the oil loss with the oil price dropping, it's kind of a twofold question, I guess. One, you listed your income tax at 30.2% for your revenues. So I'm wondering what the impact of that looks. One, with people who were previously employed over in Alberta coming back now probably having to claim EI, and that would be now another thing that's coming out of revenues, as well as federal transfers and Alberta potentially not paying into those this year, and if that was something that you took into consideration in the planning of this budget.
So we're still in the planning stages of this budget, and so again, I'm not sure if the mic would have picked that up, so I'll just restate some of those things. So the question was, with the changes, particularly when you look at what we know about Nova Scotians who traveled west to work, and with the downturn, that many of them may be unemployed now and coming back, even if they had been on regular commuting sessions out west, that they may be coming back on employment insurance programs. And how does that factor in, as well as with the changes in Newfoundland and Alberta and some other jurisdictions, as to how their role and contributions to the federal transfer programs would play out. So all of that does factor in, and that's all part of the forecasting process, and that's where departments across the country and with our federal counterparts, we're all engaged in that analysis, and that is all part of what plugs into the data on the revenue side for our expected revenues.
So is that something that you'll look into then offsetting in other areas of the budget to make up for those potential losses, and as well as increase on your debt side from the
Well, and that's the challenge. So EI is a federal program that gets managed. So in terms of the cost on that side, it goes through the federal side of things as opposed to the provincial. But as far as what impact it has on revenue, of course, when, as I've said, we are doing our analysis and we come up with a total amount, we know it's not going to be massive difference from what we have. I mean, it's going to be plus or minus, in that $9.8 billion range. So we have a good bulk of what we're going to be at. You're talking hundreds of millions of dollars in variance potentially from last year to this year. But net all of that, as of December's data, so this is as of December's data, we were forecasting real GDP growth of 0.8%, inclusive of all of the information that we had at that point in time. Oh, sorry, I had some other questions that we had for people to consider. I actually had 3 questions that I was asking of the audience. So if you can take a minute on the next question, which is, what's one thing that you or your family need? So not to be all pessimistic to the point of some questions earlier about what you might have in terms of changes, but what enhancements? So what is something that you or your family may need, program or service, that are not currently? So what is the new thing you would like to see in this budget, where we invest?
I did have a question here just
Yep.
before you went to the next one, so I think we owe it to you to ask your
Yep.
question.
Your government had to make some major changes with the Nova Scotia healthcare and also the regional enterprise, which I'm part of, so thank you for that. I want to ask something about the school boards. Are you looking at amalgamation with the school boards?
So the question is whether or not we're looking at amalgamating school boards, and I believe the Minister of Education gets asked that question from time to time. She went through a comprehensive task force that she established. There were thousands of Nova Scotians that participated in that consultation process with a lot of changes. In terms of, again, you're looking at a roadmap of changes and the timing of it. The changes that were identified as priorities from the education perspective was, one, putting money back into the classrooms, which we've done in our first 2 budgets. We've seen over 300 teachers added back to the classroom across Nova Scotia in those budgets. It includes changes to the curriculum. So they started with the P to 3 age group, consulted with educators. I think there were over, again, it's not my portfolio, so this is, I do have a lot of teachers in my family though, so I believe there were over 500 outcomes identified in the education side of things for P to 3. They reduced that down by, I can't remember if they reduced it to 200 or 300, but they've made almost a 50% reduction without sacrificing the learning. It's just about the specific volume of items that we're looking for outcomes. So they're condensing them to ensure you get the learning, but without all of the administration of checking the boxes for making sure that a teacher's taught 500 unique outcomes. You get the intention of the learning covered in a fewer number, and that was established in consultation. So the focus is on that type of education change and reform in the education department at this point in time. And that's what they've been working on. And, you know, again, I made reference earlier about the labor changes. There was a tentative agreement. It's public that the teachers rejected that tentative agreement. And what we've heard publicly from teachers was it wasn't the fiscal side of the envelope that they were concerned with. It was the working side of the envelope that they were concerned with. And so negotiations are continuing to have those conversations as to what and how that gets moved forward. So, again, very committed to the education side of things. And making the reforms that enhance the education and the money we put back in, we want to see going to the classroom, to the students and the teachers in that sense.
Are you hoping that people will address your question?
Well, you know, just the way that we've been processing, it's fine. I do hope you write them down on your cards, your thoughts. We can just collect them and bring them back. That's fine. For people online, pretty flexible. So I've been answering questions in kind of a Q&A format. But I really am interested in people answering these questions, and there is one more question, which is, what is a program or service you would be willing to sacrifice in order to see improvements in another area? So the first question being, what is basically off limits from your perspective? The second one is, what do we think we need that we're not currently providing? And then the last one is, if you recognize it's a trade-off, what is that thing that you're willing to sacrifice in order to see something else enhanced? And so those are the, you know, just getting people thinking. So again, back to my overall discussion about what we're talking about in terms of the budgeting process, we recognize that we aren't expecting a windfall of money. So the opportunity to make, you know, massive changes in enhancing programs or services by dollars just being put into them doesn't exist. That money's going to come from somewhere. And so what I'm putting forward to Nova Scotians, as you prepare to write, and again, you can do it online, through Twitter, Facebook, email, budget@novascotia.ca, traditional mail, and I think we even set up a toll-free number that's available for you to call in and provide your suggestions. I just ask that when Nova Scotians are thinking about those suggestions, that they keep these concepts in mind, because these are the types of questions that we ask ourselves when we're going through the budgeting process. What are those things that Nova Scotians really need? And we know, I mean, healthcare, education, these are the priorities that Nova Scotians consistently tell us. So how do we continue to deliver and continue to invest in them? And we want to be able to do that and continue to enhance them because we know Nova Scotians deserve them. But we also need to do it in a fiscally sustainable manner, because it's not fair to my children and my grandchildren that we consume those programs and services today and they have to pay for them tomorrow. So that's the mindset I want people in when they are having those conversations and responding. So I appreciate if you keep putting them down. If you have a couple more questions, I think we have
I have a question from Twitter, and I don't know if it falls in your bailiwick or not. It's a healthcare expenditure item. Alana from Twitter asked that insulin pump funding be revamped and especially take the age limit off. So
yeah. And again,
specific.
that's something in very, very specific. So the question, I guess your mic is tied in specifically to insulin pumps, a particular program offered, and I believe, I forget what the age limit is right now, but it is, I think, at a youth level that it's being provided for youth. And so that's something I think the Department of Health would be looking at in terms of their prioritization of all of their health programs and services that they offer. But that's the difficult type of decisions we have when, you know, when people are making proposals and ideas. And the ones I've seen either as the local MLA in my constituency office for local Antigonish representatives, either individual citizens or stakeholder groups, it's very seldom that I have someone come into my office, again, either as MLA or as finance minister, where I can sit back and say, that's a bad idea in and of itself. You know, an NGO that proposes to deliver a program to a community that has positive social outcomes for your community, for Nova Scotians, I cannot sit there and say that's a bad thing. But I do have to ask the question each and every time, can we afford it? It's not that it's a bad thing, but can we afford it? Because it has to come from somewhere. At some point, sometime, someone has to pay for it. So that's the mindset that I'm in as I go through the budgeting process.
We go back to the audience again. Do you have a question, Lucille?
I have many questions, but I think a point that I want to make that I would like to hear you comment upon is certainly the situation of rural communities, and that's your constituency. And it's the constituency of many of our representatives. And it seems to me that under this kind of a approach, that we're not going to do things in the kind of creative ways that we need to do to be able to revitalize rural communities. So in some ways I would say that when someone is coming to your office and presenting something that is of value to the community, the question becomes, how do we look at supporting that in a way that revitalizes community and enriches community and make sure that we can continue to grow community? And I want to say that I think that there is some really solid thinking on that does possibly require moving some funding around, but that thinking needs to have a rural focus. And if it doesn't have a rural focus, we're going to see increasing cuts to communities in rural areas that come from an urban-centric approach that's population-based as opposed to how do we sustain what's here. So I'd love to hear your ideas on how we sustain rural.
So the question, essentially, I'll sum it up with what you said at the very end, which is essentially how is it that we can apply creative thinking and so on to sustain rural side of the province, right? Which is about half of our population continues to reside in rural parts of the province. So, I mean, a big part of that equation is, again, back to the economic side of things. And, you know, our government, I mean, when we talk about structural, as I talked earlier about structural change and what we're doing, we've changed our approach to doing that. We've separated out what business development funding is and carved it out and allocated to Nova Scotia Business Inc., to InnovaCorp, created the Invest Nova Scotia Board, arm's length from cabinet, so it's not politically motivated decision making in terms of the economic value, so we can get the maximum value of those investments for our economic engines throughout the province. To the extent of how and where and can that help and work, I can say and so that everything isn't doom and gloom. Just in the last 2 weeks, I've had two separate organizations in Nova Scotia, in Anakanish, that I've met with that have really positioned themselves very well. And most people, even in Anakanish, wouldn't have heard of either of these companies. So there are lots of things going on very positively in our rural communities, like Anakanish, that a lot of Nova Scotians don't even know about. And part of what we need to do, and part of the creative that doesn't cost a lot of money, is we need to have these conversations and celebrate the successes and get the word out there about the creativity, the ingenuity, and the opportunity that our rural communities provide. And really with the advent of technology, look at the education people are receiving here at St.FX or down in Wolfville at Acadia. These are being done in rural communities. And you're not disadvantaged when you have access to the technology and the infrastructure to connect you basically to the world or to the context to bring people in to be creative and contribute. And when you're talking about social program changes and things on that side of the equation, again, if it's creative thinking, but we do have to, again, still ask that question. How do we afford to make sure that that change is sustainable? Because often when programs, and whether they're on the economic development side or on the social program delivery side, often programs are started with the best of intentions, but I don't think we've always considered how long. And we have to start, as you say, move some of the money around to make those changes, because what happens is often we stop asking ourselves the question, or we just forget to ask the question as Nova Scotians. These programs that have been around for 20 or 30 years Are they still delivering the outcomes that they were intended to deliver on? And are those outcomes still the priorities of Nova Scotia today? And that's the kind of questioning that we are trying to make. And we are sensitive to the impacts in all jurisdictions of the province. And we do try to strike that balance in the moves that we make.
More questions from the class I have here.
Okay.
But both of them, and again, this seems to be a theme we're hitting on here, is how do we build the economy? How do we get economic growth going again? And in this case, one refers to the ban on fracking and asking the question, where do we go from here in terms of developing Nova Scotia resources? The other one says, how do we encourage more companies to come to Nova Scotia? How are we doing on that front? And does corporate tax rate factor into that?
Okay. So, question around resource development side of things, and then the other one on general business development. So on the resource side, we have resource development in Nova Scotia. We have a growing resource development in Nova Scotia, even amongst the downturn in the oil and gas sector. We've got Shell has already started drilling one of their test wells offshore. That's $1 billion. That's a billion-dollar play. BP is partnered to also start doing a test well offshore. So there is interest. From a broad economic perspective, and I'm not talking, so I'm just talking on an economic context, if these organizations, in light of where the industry is today for the price of oil and gas and the cutbacks that the industry is seeing on capital investments, to see that they remain committed to the offshore Nova Scotia play suggests that they have a high probability of success, that there's good value in that. And so when you talk about what can Nova Scotia do and support, we're looking at how do we support industries as a whole. So if you look at something like the oil and gas sector, it's fairly speculative. It takes a lot of groundwork and research to identify where there may potentially be resources to access. So how do companies choose where to go? They have to do a lot of research and invest in that. Well, the province of Nova Scotia has invested, and our government has extended that investment into something called fairway play analysis, which is essentially the province has paid for a bunch of offshore exploration geological assessment of our offshore. That information is available to industry players so they don't have to make that initial investment with risk. They can come in and assess the data that's already been collected. So at the riskiest point, which is the early stages, that industry, but it's open to everybody in the industry, that can then help them make their decision as to whether they want to invest and move forward in a Nova Scotia play. And so it's an investment being made, equitable to all industry, rather than just saying, hey, what's that one company we want to try to attract to Nova Scotia? As far as other initiatives on the business development side, again, on an industry perspective, the Minister of Agriculture is very, very active in his agriculture and aquaculture. They've established some more stringent regulations around the aquaculture sector to move forward with that industry, so they're quite optimistic with that side of things and the export potential there. On the agriculture side, you're looking at things like the growth in vineyards for our wine sector, which has an agricultural component, employing people in rural communities in that space. So there are a lot of things, again, trying to encourage capital investment, which stays here, as well as in investing in things that provide that value throughout. And of course, export focused. You know, if we can bring the businesses here, particularly taking advantage of the low Canadian dollar to drive our exports. And remember, exports means that someone else's money is coming into Nova Scotia. That's new money adding to our economy versus, you know, selling locally, moving the money around here. It's also great to have exports to see new money coming in for products and services being produced here in Nova Scotia. Budget at novascotia.ca, our Facebook site, just the government Facebook site, Twitter at NS Finance. There's an 800 number as well as a regular mail address to my office.